Alexander, before we talk about the Altera Biosciences, who is Alexandra Miszewski? I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, the full name right. Beyond the science, how did your journey into biotech begin?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So, it's quite an interesting story. So, I come from a finance background. I did an undergrad in um, finance, did a business science finance, and then I did a master's in investment management. And I never sort of directly set out to be an entrepreneur or to end up in biotech. It sort of just worked out that way. And it all stemmed from my darling horse Emma. So when I was 16, I was very fortunate in that my parents bought me a horse. As I mentioned, her name was Emma. And unfortunately, she sustained a really, really bad injury, which is generally considered to be a career-ending injury. And in my quest to save her, I unfortunately quite quickly exhausted, most of the commercially available treatment options and sort of refused to believe that there was nothing more that could be done. And with a group of vets and some scientists, we developed sort of the first version of what is now known as the Regenesis vet technology. And it was a key sort of um, turning point that helped Emma make a full recovery. And, through that whole process, I realized that um, that injury and all the problems I'd faced wasn't as unique to me as I thought it was. And there was an option to do a lot of good and help other horses. And that is sort of how my journey into the healthcare sector began. That was first in, I think, 2016, 2017 that started. So nearly 10 years now.
And then you went into the Ellen Gray Foundation. How did that experience shape you as a founder?
So,
Mhm.
sorry.
I mean, we were just in grade six and your marks were good, and they said, this girl, we should just put her in this pad here.
No, so I'm laughing because I'm sure anyone who's either has gone through the fellowship or has applied for the fellowship knows sort of the pain you go through with the application process and the interviews and everything. But I already was working on my first venture when I applied for the Alan Gray Orbis fellowship. I think I was in third year university. It was, I think, the last intake where you could sort of apply so late. And what really drew me to the fellowship is the amount of entrepreneurial support that they give. So for anyone who isn't too familiar with the Alan Gray Orbis Fellowship, it basically is a like a program or an organization that was founded by Dr. Alan Gray, the founder of Alan Gray. And his sort of belief was that, what Africa and specifically South Africa really needs are responsible, high impact entrepreneurs. And he sort of felt that that was the, through job creation, through being a high impact entrepreneur, that was sort of the way forward for South Africa. So I applied in third year. I already was working on the first venture I was involved in, which was equinetendon.com, which is still around today. And, it's I'm sort of jumping around a bit, but it's something I've spoken quite openly about. I really struggled with ADHD growing up. I was diagnosed super, super young. And, I think anyone who is neurodivergent will probably identify with the statement that you realize quite early on that you're a little bit different. Not different as in sort of bad or good or um you're better or worse. You're just a little bit different. And that's something I'd really, struggled with a bit growing up. And I'll never forget, I'd sort of had gone through the interviews, the the first few processes at selection camp. And my sort of overwhelming memory was like a very deep sense of belonging, and I don't think I'd ever been in a room where there were so many people who also saw the world differently. And, you know, if I look at my entrepreneurial journey and, my mindset as a founder, as you've asked, I think one of the most formative experiences I've had, and I think one of the most unfair advantages I've had, is going through that Alan Gray Orbis Fellowship. Like, as an entrepreneur, especially a young entrepreneur, there is nothing those people don't give you that like gives you the opportunity to succeed. They give you business coaches, they gave you mentorship, you get access to capital. And, I think even more importantly for me, I think when I look at my mindset as an entrepreneur, as I mentioned earlier, the whole program is sort of centered around this idea of high impact, responsible entrepreneurship. And it's something that, I think we sort of very airy fairy often talk about. But, if you look at someone like Dr. Alan Gray and the impact he's had and how much good you can be, how much good you can do whilst still being wildly successful, um, it it really it was an experience that really had an impact on me. And I think one of the most valuable things I gained from it is a I don't want to say a refinement of my value set, but it's the mindset and the framework that sort of gets taught and modeled. And if I look at, and these aren't just personal values, but especially in an entrepreneurial context, who I am and like what I aspire to do, a lot of it's got to do around integrity, significance, excellence, making a difference. And the Orbis Foundation and the sort of fellowship program like really nurtures that. And, I graduated from the fellowship like a good few years ago now. But, in all the really difficult decisions I have to make, where it's like really, what do you do? What decision do you make? I so heavily rely on that framework and, that sort of mindset, in order to make tough decisions. It sort of like serves as a bit of a North Star. So yeah, it's been one of the most incredible experiences I've had, and I am eternally grateful for it.
Let's get back to the Altera Bioscience tech company. I mean, biotech isn't biotech isn't a common path for African entrepreneurs, but you also explained that you got into this field or aspects because of your journey and your molding around the horses and how you felt for the horses, um, variability in terms of their strength and their weaknesses in order to like hype their for lack of a better word, let's just say you provide strength or just resilience in terms of their physicality. Africa's genetic diversity is it's a key part of your mission. Why do you see that as an advantage, not a challenge?
So I think Africa's genetic diversity is one of like the world's biggest untapped biotech assets. A lot of drugs and therapies are developed and tested on uh, populations that don't have a huge amount of genetic diversity. And where you sort of run into challenges is that when you take those therapies to other parts of the world where there is more genetic diversity, they often don't really perform as expected, or you have outcomes you don't necessarily want. So if you look at a African setting and you're developing therapies in an area like Africa where there is a lot of genetic diversity, they sort of are more universally applicable from day one. If something's applicable to the widest genetic diversity set, it's always going to be fine if it's narrower. But if you start with a very narrow base, you run into a lot of problems when you sort of look at taking those to more genetically diverse areas. So, in the context of Altera, where we are sort of working towards the development of a universal donor cell platform, that it's a really important sort of fundamental that our advantage that we believe our business has being based in Africa.
I think it was 2 months back. I interviewed the founder of Super Bowl and Bash, Cloud Anan. Um, and one of the things they mentioned was they were struggling to actually get funding from like Takealot and these big organizations for their business, right? And I mean, I must mention that, and also like I also mentioned that, raising funding for companies like tech companies because he didn't invest actually to this African guy. I think after then this guy went on to go to America and then he created the unicorn company in that time period in America. And I must mention that how did you actually raise funding for a biotech company? I mean, I'm sure. I mean, we know that there's tech companies like your I forgot the sweep salt by Aisha Pando. You have your Yoko in Nigeria, but mostly they get funding from overseas. How did you raise funding in the African continent? And I'm sure it must be tough. How did you convince investors to actually provide funding for your business?
So I get asked this question quite a few times or quite often. And it's tricky. I have both a huge amount of gratitude, but also in a way like a little bit of guilt because I think our funding experience is and was very different to what I hear from a lot of other entrepreneurs. So where do I even start? So in 2022, through one of the other ventures I was involved in, I was introduced to Dr. Nick Walker at the One Bio team. As far as sort of deep tech and biotech goes, specifically sort of biotech, we are very fortunate to have One Bio, which is a specialist biotech venture capital firm based in Cape Town. So I was introduced to them, as I said, through a mutual contact due to something else I was working on, nothing to do with Altera. And I think I met with Nick a few times and we had a few conversations. And he said, there's the scientist that I really, really want you to meet. His name is Professor Michael Pepper, who is now my co-founder in Altera. And he introduced me to Michael. And I think within like an hour of Michael and I meeting, we decided we were going to start a company together, which eventually led to Altera. And so One Bio was one of is Altera's lead investor, and then the other big investor we have is E Squared, which is Alan Gray's venture capital arm. And I think what makes our experience, I don't want to say different, or if you're asking me sort of how I think we did it, I really felt very strongly that both those venture capital firms, more so than anything, were investing in Michael and I. If I'm honest with you, like what we first took to the first investment committee and what eventually got funded are, like, when I say wildly different things, I can't emphasize that enough. And definitely for the better. And, as I said, I really feel like both of those VCs that have invested in us more so than anything were sort of investing in Michael and I as a founding team. And, the support we got from them was just unbelievable. It was, I feel in part almost like a venture build. You know, there's certain things they're really excited about. There were certain things Michael and I were really excited about. And over nearly a year and a half, 2 year period, it was us refining and coming up with a business plan that we all felt we could get behind, and dedicate Michael and I the next at least probably 10 years of our lives. And for the investors, a significant amount of capital to making a reality. And, it's that approach, you often hear people say, oh, the VCs invest in the team, not the idea. But the way I've seen One Bio and E Squared like actually live those values is like no other experience I think I've ever had before. I mean, we had quite a few as you do in entrepreneurship, we had quite a few like key um not ideas. I've got to be quite careful from sort of an intellectual property and confidentiality point of view. I obviously can't disclose everything, but there were a few key foundational sort of competitive advantages and early, and important things that some of the earlier versions of the deal that were built around that just like didn't materialize, or we couldn't make it work, or the financial terms of what we needed like weren't feasible or sustainable. And I mean, we had so much input from the VCs, and I'll never forget, I think we had like an IP structuring and we had this like massive workshop, like multi-hour workshop with this big law firm. And, you know, there were all the key people from One Bio and E Squared on the meeting. They hadn't even invested in us yet. So, and as a founder, I've got so much gratitude. Nick and Marco from One Bio, you know, from E Squared originally, Gladwin, Lou, and Sean Kutsia were involved in the deal, and it sort of went on for so long. We eventually had Brett, Obi, and Pierre that sort of were part of the foundational team that sort of got it across the line. But I think it was a group of people who were all really, really passionate about investing from an investor side, and from our side, dedicating a lot of time towards building something that we all really hope is meaningful and one day will hopefully change, if not save, a significant amount of lives. So yeah, it was a very collaborative process. It wasn't, this is exactly what we want to do. We've got it all figured out. Like, please give us all this money. It was like, first and foremost, we want to make an impact. This is where we think medicine is going. This is what we think we have an advantage of being in Africa. How can we leverage all these advantages we have in our expertise to build something that we can all get excited about? I feel it's been quite a different experience to what a lot of my other sort of friends that are founders have gone through. And, as an entrepreneur, when you not just see, but also feel that your investors are as invested as they are. And at least speaking for myself, I really think it brings out the best of me, as a founder in a way. It's quite a complicated thing to articulate, but I feel incredibly grateful for the experience we've had and for the investors that we're walking this journey with.
How do you think Africa can position itself as a leader in the advanced medical field in terms of technology advancements, just bridging that gap compared to the
I think we need to be a creator of advanced medical technologies, not a consumer. I think that's what it fundamentally comes down to. And I think we're going to do that by, developing our own high value intellectual property locally. We need to own our data. There needs to be regulatory and funding environments that reward scientific risk taking. A lot of that also comes through exits. You obviously need government buy-in from a regulatory point of view, but we need to stop sort of, exporting, for lack of a better word, like our raw talent and, innovation. I think we saw, during COVID and in multiple other instances, just how good the science is here and how good our scientists are here. And we need to invest in research where you're going to take discoveries from the lab all the way to the market. That's I think that's the most important.
just one more question before we close off. What advice would you give to any young? Because I want to get back to I think when you started this company, how old were you? You were 20,
Which one?
the Altera Biosciences,
Altera, I was 25, I think. 25,
25. Okay. So that was
24,
okay.
24, 24. I think it was 24.
What advice would you give to just looking back at your career to anyone who's aspiring to get to your position, to get to the Alexander Miszewski's position as a successful entrepreneur in the African continent? What advice would you share to any aspiring entrepreneur, that whether black, whether white, you're just telling the young kid that no, this is the route you can take. Where could you start?
I don't know if I'd consider myself successful just yet. I sort of feel like I've been very lucky to be able to do a lot sort of over the past 10 years of my career, but I'd like to think that I hope obviously as far as impact goes that, I haven't yet scratched the surface. But I can tell you, yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice I could give if it was to like a 17, 18, 19-year-old is that I think courage will take you far further than certainty ever would or will. I think when I was much younger and I looked at people who were successful, I sort of had always assumed that they, got everything figured out. But as time goes on, I think I'm more convinced that it's actually the opposite. You succeed because you don't have everything figured out, but to move forward, you have to figure it out. And that's got a lot to do with courage. And it's not what's really important to remember is it's not like delusional courage or like bravery in the absence of fear. Um, I think it's choosing a fear that moves and motivates you. For me, the fear of staying still or staying the same or not trying to create a better outcome, for people who end up in situations where I've been in and felt like I didn't get a good outcome, that's always been greater than my fear of failing. And, I think that sort of leads me to my next point, which sort of ties this all together, um, which is a lot of entrepreneurship, I think, has got to do with the capacity to tolerate discomfort. And the more you care about the problem you're working on, and the bigger that problem is for yourself, I think the larger your tolerance for discomfort will be, which, I think has got a large role to play in how much you can endure, which is unfortunately, I think, often um, what is needed for success. Success is not an overnight thing. It's a long journey. There's a lot of highs and lows. And I don't know, with entrepreneurship, I think unless you are working towards something that, you know, is bigger than yourself and that matters to you so much that you would still care about it, even if no one knew your name was ever attached to it, or that you were ever working on it, unless you sort of care about and resonate with the problem so deeply, I think you're in for a bit of a rough ride. The last thing I would say, particularly in an African context, is that it doesn't matter if your path doesn't look like everyone else's. I think you'll often be told you're too early, you're too young, you're too ambitious, you're too this, you're too that, you'll be too something. Um, but if they're telling you that, firstly, I think you're definitely on the right track. And yeah, if you care about something enough that it keeps you awake at night, it's something that's probably worth doing.
Thank you so much for coming through to the interview today.
Thank you so much for having me.